Gopishana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravana Chari Jamuna Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya. Vishma Paramahansa Rajakacharya, also the Siswed AC, Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jai, Prem Sagaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Advaita Gadadhar, Shri Gaur Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai, Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopita Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai, Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Navadip Dham Ki Jai, Ganga Jamuna Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai, Samaveta Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai, Go Premanandi. All glories to the Sam devotees, all glories to the Sam devotees, all glories to the Sam devotees, all glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nityanamane Namaste Saraswata Deve Gauravani Prachadane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachate Shatadane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Bhaktivedanta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Read from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Vayuna Hrita Gandha Bhu Salilata Vyakalpate Salidam Tadrita Rasam Joshchisvyaya Vakalpate Vayuna, by the wind, Ruta, deprived, Ganda, of quality of aroma, Bhu, element earth, Salilata, fire, kalpate, becomes water, salilam, water, tat, by that, prita rasam, deprived of its quality of taste, jostisvaya upakalpate, becomes fire. Translation: deprived of its quality of aroma by the wind, the element earth is transformed into water, and water, deprived of its taste by that same wind, is merged into fire. Report Srimad Bhagavatam gives several descriptions of the material creation by which air is expanded from ether, fire from water, water from fire, and earth from water. Now, in the reverse order, the creation is wound up. Thus, earth merges back into the water from which it came, and water similarly merges into fire. Text 14. Fire, deprived of its form by darkness, dissolves into the element air. When the air loses its quality of touch by the influence of space, the air merges into that space. When space is deprived of its tangible quality by the Supreme Soul in the form of time, space merges into false ego, the mode of ignorance. My dear King, the material senses and intelligence merge into the false ego in the mode of passion, from which they arose. The mind, along with the demigods, merges into the false ego in the mode of goodness. Then the total false ego, along with all of its qualities, merges into the Mahatattva. I have now described Maya, the illusory energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This illusory potency, consisting of the three modes of material nature, is empowered by the Lord for the creation, maintenance, and annihilation of the material universe. Now, what more do you wish to hear? Purport: King Nemi has expressed to the Navyogendras his fear of the illusory potency of the Lord and has requested a detailed explanation of Maya so that he could avoid becoming victim at her hands. Now, Sri Antariksha, having described the illusory potency, is suggesting that the king inquire about the means to become totally free of Maya's influence. Not waiting for the king to ask such a question, Sri Antariksha himself suggesting, now that you have heard about Maya's influence, you should inquire about the process of becoming free of such influence. According to Sridhar Swami, that is the significance of Sri Antariksha's question, Kim bhuya srotamichyati, what more do you wish to hear? The following is a summary of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's explanation of the process of annihilation described in the previous verses. Vasudeva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the presiding deity of consciousness which becomes manifest within the Mahatattva. By further transformation of the Mahatattva, the threefold false ego appears as follows. From Vaikarika, false ego in the mode of goodness, appears the 11th sense, the mind, whose presiding deity is Aniruddha. From Taijasa, false ego in the mode of passion, comes intelligence, whose presiding deity is Pradumna, and the 5 working senses, and 5 knowledge-gathering senses with their presiding deities. 3. From false ego in the mode of ignorance arises the subtle form of sound, and from sound or sabda, all material elements gradually become manifest, beginning with ether and sense of hearing. The presiding deity of these 3 divisions of false ego is Shankarshana. This description is taken from chapter 26 of 3rd Canto of Bhagavatam, verses 21, 27, 28, 30, 31, 32, and 35. The Supreme Personality of Godhead's external potency, Maya, causes the birth, maintenance, and destruction of the material world. She is tricolored, red, white, and black. In her red feature, the material nature is created, and white it endures, and in black it is annihilated. The Mahatattva arises from this Maya, and from that Mahatattva comes the 3 varieties of false ego mentioned above. At the time of annihilation, the 5 great elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether, merge into the false ego in the mode of ignorance from which they were originally generated. The 10 senses and intelligence merge into false ego and passion, and the mind, along with the demigods, merges into false ego in the mode of goodness. which then merges into Mahatattva, which further takes shelter of Prakriti or unmanifest Pradhan. As described above, each of the gross elements is wound up when its distinguishing quality is removed. The element then merges into the previous element. This can be understood as follows. In space or ether, there is the quality of sound. In air, there are the qualities of sound and touch. In fire, there are sound, touch, and form. In water, there are sound, touch, form, and taste. And in earth, there are sound, touch, form, taste, and aroma. Therefore, from ether down to earth, each element is distinguished by the addition of its own unique quality called guna vishesham. When this quality is removed, an element becomes non-different from its previous element and thus merges into it. For example, when great wind takes aroma away from the earth, earth contains only sound, touch, form, and taste, and thus becomes non-different from water, into which it merges. Similarly, when water loses its rasa or taste, it contains only sound, touch, and form, thus becoming non-different from fire, which also contains those three qualities. So the wind takes away aroma to merge earth into water and takes away taste to merge water into fire. Then when the universal darkness removes form from fire, fire merges into air. Space then removes the sense of touch from air, and air merges into space. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, at the time, as the time element, removes sound from space, and space then merges into false ego in the mode of ignorance from which it arose. Finally, false ego is merged into Mahatattva, which is merged into the unmanifest Pradhan, and thus the universe is annihilated. This completes that description of the destruction of the universe. Now, the original question was to talk about Maya. So this whole section talks about that, and finally the subject of destruction of the manifest universe was discussed. And it ends with this particular description of how the visible universe finally merges back into Prakriti. So as the purport explains, the evolution of the elements takes place from Prakriti or Pradhan to Mahatattva to Ahankara, and then we get the mind and the senses, the sense objects, and finally the gross elements, emerging one after the other. So in the destruction, the opposite takes place. We start from the very gross things, and they gradually merge into the more subtle things. So therefore the gross elements are the grossest, and of the gross elements, earth is the grossest. So starting with earth, then earth emerges back into its previous element, water, water into fire, fire into air, and air into ether, and then ether goes into Ahankara and the mode of ignorance from which it arose. And similarly, all the senses merge back into Ahankara in the mode of passion, and the mind and the sense devatās merge into Ahankara in the mode of goodness. Then all of these three modes of Ahankara, they're merged back into Ahankara. Ahankara came from Mahatattva. So everything merges into Mahatattva. And then Mahatattva merges into Pradhan or Prakriti. So it goes backwards. So this is a standard description of the creation of the elements, or it's the manifestation of the elements, and then dissolution of the elements. And we'll see it in many places, starting in the third canto. It is not only in the Bhagavatam. You'll find this mentioned in Upanishads also. So that's the original, say the Shrutis, talk about this manifestation of the world, etc. We also find a similar description in Sankhya philosophy, where they talk about the 24 elements. So it's a very similar type of discussion. But the point here is that this Maya, as was explained previously, is an obstruction for the jīva. It creates an upadhi, or a covering on the jīva, and then the jīva misidentifies with it and wanders about in the material world from body to body. thinking that the body is reality, and he forgets about the soul, and he forgets about the Supreme Lord. So this is the whole problem of Maya. So this whole discussion takes place because we do have to define this world. And of course, human beings, because they do have some intelligence when they observe things, then they will ask this question, what is the world? So for people who are of lower consciousness, I would say, yes, this is the world, and it's a place where I can enjoy happiness. Somehow I can get my happiness out of this material world. So that's the first, lowest type of consciousness. It is, we can say, similar to animals, except animals don't ask the question. But human being asks the question, and then he gets the answer, the happiness, and then the happiness is very similar to the animal's happiness, eating, sleeping, mating, defending, whatever. Same. Then, of course, you can develop a little more, and then the happiness is defined less on the gross platform of body, and then we get to the mind. So we have things which are more subtle, that don't involve simply maintaining the material body, like food and water and air. So then we develop all sorts of ideas in our mind. We develop arts and sciences and so many things to stimulate the mind. And then we get some happiness out of stimulation of the mind in various ways. So for most people in the material world, this is the answer. The world is meant for this enjoyment, gross enjoyment or subtle enjoyment. And then we have persons who are more advanced, and then they'll ask, well, yes, this is what life is for. It's the material world is here, and it's only for our happiness. But then they will ask the question, well, it's not perfect. It's a mixed bag. It's not all happiness. But why is that? So how can we get continual happiness? And then they'll seek some method of doing that. So they can try through science by improving your health or your lifespan or whatever like this, or for various things. But we know that all these attempts are futile. They don't succeed. It's very, very difficult to do that. So some people reach the conclusion that therefore life is imperfect. You cannot have complete happiness now. It's no one's seen it in the past, and nobody's seen it at the present, so it is impossible to get that type of happiness. So then they begin to ask again, well, how can we get that happiness? That eternal happiness or a perfect state? And then they can come to the conclusion that maybe there's another world, another higher world. So therefore we get the concept of Svargaloka or something like that. We can go to another place after we die, and we can enjoy better. And then to do that, then we have to do certain activities. So this is why we get scriptures, the Karma Kanda section of scriptures, to satisfy people by giving them a happy material life. But not here, because it doesn't work. So you go to higher planet. So, that's one solution to the problem, a heavenly existence where there's minimum of suffering and maximum lifespan, etc. So still, this is material, subtle, gross material, subtle material. We can just go to two levels, but it's still material. Then people can, they still inquire, well, yes, this is still temporary. And then the next stage is to come to the awareness that material life is no good at all. So we reject everything. And we find many philosophies do that, like Buddhism, reject the material world, finished, and you're free. But the whole problem is how to stop the cycle of birth and death and reject the material world. So we have all sorts of sadhanas for doing that. So this is the another attempt to answer this question: what is this material world? And then we find out it's useless, so let's reject it somehow or other. But that is a rather the result of that is we reject the world, and what is there? Nothing. So you end up in nothing. So then that's not a very satisfying solution. Also, nothing.
still, it doesn't satisfy us as far as our sense of being is concerned, because we want happiness. So it doesn't really solve the question. We end up as nothing. So it gets rid of the material world, but it doesn't really solve the question. Anyway, one result of this, of course, is that they understand the material world, at least, is not a very good place. It's like a prison house. Some good comes out of that. So we can go on asking this question, and of course we get answers in the scriptures, but we get various answers. And even if we don't have the Vedic scriptures, people in other places, they also ask the same questions, and they also come up with all sorts of answers. So we get a variety of answers to this question: what is this world, and who am I in this material world? All of which are imperfect, because we can't really understand on our own. So we do have to go to scripture at a certain point in time. And even the scripture then becomes confusing, because they do have sections dealing with karma kanda and gyan kanda and bhakti. So we get alternative versions there also. So we have to be very careful when we go to scripture also, that we understand the conclusion of scripture, not the secondary aspects of it. So if we go to the Vedic scriptures, then we can understand that, yes, the material world is not the best place. It is a prison house, and we should get out of that prison house. But then it also answers the question, who am I? It's not that we just destroy the prison and then there's nothing. So it also gives us an answer that I am actually a spiritual particle, Atma, Jīva. On our own, we may not come to that conclusion. It's very difficult to conclude that. Of course, if one gets a sattva gun, there's a tendency to understand, yes, I'm not the body, I'm something else. So but it's not well defined, so therefore people go off in different, they end up with all sorts of speculations about what is the self or the I. And of course, one speculation is the self is Brahman, is everything. And that's the Advaita philosophy. So if we go on our own independently, or we misinterpret scriptures, then we end up with the wrong conclusion also. So therefore we have to go through the scripture very carefully, and then we come to the conclusion that we can find real happiness when we accept that I'm not the body, I am Atma, I'm a spiritual particle. But then we also have to accept a supremely independent Lord. And when we can accept that, then we can get the happiness that the Jīva wants. We're looking for happiness in the material world. We get that when we accept the Supreme Lord. But on our own, very difficult to figure that out. So without scripture, then we can make all sorts of speculations about what is the Atma, or who is God, etc. To some degree, there may be some correct aspects, but there are also faulty aspects. So we have a Jīva who's a Jīva, but then he's not permanent, maybe. And then he's also subject to disappearing. Or we only have Jīvas and no Supreme Lord. Or we have Jīvas who are false and they become Brahman, they become the Lord. So we get all varieties of speculation about Jīva, Supreme Lord, and the relationship. But we have to get the answer from somewhere, so that's why we rely on Scripture. And so Scripture defines a Supreme Lord and a Jīva, and defines the material world also in relation to the Jīva and the Supreme Lord. So that is why we have this whole discussion here of the material world, even though for devotees it is technical and it's not so interesting, simply just like science, So you learn all about atoms and protons and neutrons and all these things and whatever. What's that got to do with me, because I want to be a devotee? So like that, all this analysis in one sense is not very helpful for the devotee. But it is helpful in one sense, because people ask this question: what is this material world and how does it work, etc. And why should I get out? So this is the answer. It's all perishable. It's all temporary. It disappears, and then finally it's not there anymore. So you can't get your happiness out of this. However, some jivas refuse to believe that. And that's why they stay in the material world. So even though the Supreme Lord winds up the creation, it all dissolves into Prakriti, and the jivas merge into the Supreme Lord's body, he creates everything again. Why? Because the jivas who are resting in the Lord and sleeping wake up and they decide, I want to get some enjoyment out of this world. So then he produces this world again for them, and he pushes them into the world, and they continue their karma with their bodies from previous Brahma's life, whatever, and they try to enjoy in this whole world that's described here again, with false identity and no recognition of the Supreme Lord. So this is the jivas who are in ignorance. They will end up in this position of being continually in illusion, in spite of the fact that they do have the possibility of getting out of this position. So the scriptures generally describe this material world as a prison. It doesn't give the world is described in a very negative manner, not as a place you can get absolute happiness. It describes it in terms of temporary happiness, illusory energy. Sometimes it's called a witch. Maya is called a witch, whatever like that. It's called a prison house, Durga, etc. And very, very difficult to overcome, get out of the prison, etc. And we're Buddha. We are bound up in chains. So that's a negative description, the whole Maya, etc., from the point of view of Scripture. Now, why so negative? Because this is to refute the ideas of the ordinary person who think a very nice material world, very nice. So that is like being in the prison and having a nice place there in golden chains or whatever like that. Very nice from one point of view, but from the absolute point of view, it's useless. So the whole description of Maya with its negative description is to encourage us to understand we should reject this material world and not make our place here permanently. The process of bhakti, however, also is not so negative, because we say that we don't reject the world as such because it's also the Lord's energy. It is real, and it can be useful also, even for the devotee. If it's used properly, it's beneficial. The same substance can be used badly and you can poison a person. You do it in something else, it becomes a medicine. I think it's Ayurveda, so they use mercury in some of the medicine, so it's very poisonous. But if it's used as a medicine and administered properly, then it's got a beneficial effect. So, therefore, the material world is, yes, negative in one sense, but it's also the energy of the Lord, and the Lord has a certain plan for it, and we can understand that plan, we can understand the law of karma, we can understand its destructible nature, etc. Then and we can also understand how we can use it in such a way that it does not create problems for us. Then we can progress in spiritual life very nicely. So even if we're in the material world, we can utilize our existence in the material world to get out of the material world. So the very definition of bhakti is that sadhana bhakti is that we use the senses and the mind to serve Krishna. So we don't stop the mind, we don't stop the senses. Now in yoga, the whole idea is to destroy material consciousness, chitta vritti nirodha, to completely destroy the functions of material consciousness. Now how do they do that? Then they have to use the mind, etc. It's just rather a backwards process. How can you destroy the mind by using the mind, meditating and then destroying it? A little difficult to do. Doesn't look like it's possible. On the other hand, we say, well, yes, we want to ultimately, yes, we can destroy the mind and the senses and the body, etc., but that's not the point. The point is to simply develop the Atma's love for the Supreme Lord, so we can utilize our senses in this body and our mind for that purpose by engaging them in service of the Lord. So even though they're material, they give no material results. Why? Because of the bhakti, because of the expression of love for the Lord. Then it doesn't have any bad effect. So we don't reject the senses or the mind at all, but we use them in a certain way, and then it has a very positive effect. So of course we can always say, well, how can a material element produce a spiritual effect? These are material elements here, like water and fire and air and ether and mind, etc. It's all gross material. How can that give it an effect? It isn't giving the effect. It's only helping. It's like the tool only. So the real thing that's giving the effect is the jīva. And when he does his devotional service, yes, he engages the mind and the senses, but what makes it into bhakti is he's directing everything towards the Supreme Lord with some devotion, some bhakti. That's what produces the effect. If we don't have the bhakti and we engage our senses, it just has very little effect. It's like namabhas. So when we have that devotion, it becomes very powerful to produce bhakti itself. If we do it without that, yes, we can destroy karma, but we don't get the bhakti. And if we do it with the bhakti increases. So engaging the senses and the mind and intelligence, etc., is a means by which our bhakti can increase and increase and increase after we get the faith. Therefore, we can engage the senses. And what happens is that ultimately the senses, of course, when they're engaged in bhakti, do not have material effect. But in the process of engaging our material senses, or say spiritualized material senses and mind, we develop spiritual senses, spiritual mind. So that when you realize the Lord with your spiritual eye, your spiritual touch, your spiritual smell, etc., your spiritual ear, etc. So you can hear the Lord, you can see the Lord, you can touch the Lord, etc. So we develop spiritual senses. We engage the material senses in serving the Lord with bhakti, and then the Atma develops a spiritual body, spiritual senses to serve the Lord. So that at a certain point you can engage fully with your spiritual body. Then you don't need the material senses and the material body at all. So they can be completely inactive, and you're engaging, doing your service in your spiritual body, though nobody can see it. And then finally you give up the material body completely, and you're in the spiritual world serving the Lord. So we see that engaging the senses, which are material to begin with, is very useful. It helps us produce spiritual body. We engage our eyes and our ears and whatever, and we develop spiritual eye and spiritual ears through that whole process. So material world is not so bad after all. Senses not so bad. Body not so bad if we engage it in the service of the Lord. Through that we can develop our spiritual form and our spiritual body, our spiritual senses, and our spiritual service. So therefore we have to look at the material world in an objective way, and we understand its negative qualities, but it's not all negative. We can also utilize the material world in the process of bhakti for our advantage.
It was mentioned that demigod's mind merges into false ego. Demigod's mind merges into...
No, mind and devatās.
So why why devatās merges into false ego?
Because in the production of the material world, it's described that there is first there is mahatattva, then there is ahankara. Ahankara manifests in a sattvic mode, a rajasic mode, and a tamasic mode. Ahankara in the sattvic mode produces the mind and the sense devatās. So there's the deity of the eye is the sun, and the deity of the ear is what the Dikpalas, and the deity of the nose is Ashwini Kumars, the deity of the tongue is Varuna, like this. So we have devatās in charge of each of your working senses and your knowledge gathering senses. So we say the prototype devata before they get their body, etc., is what we call the devatā that are manifest. And of course, only after we get the combination of material elements, we get actual bodies for devatās. When the sense devata and then the senses and the gross elements and the tanmatras combine together, they make the bodies, and then we get actual bodies of Varuna and sun deity, etc.
So basically, sense devatās are matter only. Sense devatās are matter only.
Yeah. So in the reverse order, then after they're manifested, they reverse backwards. They all merge into the sattvic ahankara, the mind and those sense devatās.
So do the sense devatās also get soul? No.
Well, yeah. When we get into the material world and then the bodies develop, there's a soul and then it develops a body. So the soul there, and we get a devatā body then we get its material elements and its senses. Also, the sense deity also has his body and his senses, etc.
So it means since Devata is a jīva, but his body is the first which manifested when the creation starts.
Yeah, well, even then, it's not. We can say a physical body. We can say it's a model for the body. It hasn't, because it hasn't formed yet into with material elements. Let's say the function, the function is there, but it doesn't develop into an actual form with the jīva in it until all the things combine together.
All right.
Now we have a new book release. Maharaj has added up yet another principle Upanishads.
So here we have principal Upanishads of 10 Upanishads coming out in the 5 books. So those who want to take from Maharaj hands can take. First book will be getting by Rao Prabhu. He is mercifully giving the place where all the books we are keeping in his room. And then Prabhujis will be in the line. And then second, Matajis can come. The donation of this books is 1000 rupees. You can pay later also. Hare Krishna. You can engage by Hari Bol or Hare Krishna mantra.
Hare
Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare